Okay, so first, Happy New Year. We made it to 2016. This is the first of several videos, I think 3 or 4, that are intended as a tutorial related to the Bloom and Lahey language analysis, language sample analysis. On this first one, which is going to be somewhat brief but direct, I want to review the thinking behind the analysis approach, the approach to Bloom and Lahey analysis. What's the thinking? Well, what I'm going to be doing first to support what I'm trying to say here is I'm going to put up for you 2 videos. One is the video of that child who is the child, 3.5-year-old child with Down syndrome, who was clipping together those beads. And if you remember from the language disorders course, I had asked you to describe the relationships the child was making, the kinds of relations the child was making as he was clipping beads together. I'm also going to post a video of my own kids playing with these stuffed plush animals on their bed. I think they were 2 and 3 at the time, maybe younger. And also I'd like you to think about the kinds of relationships they were making, and also take a look at their language. At the end of this video, I will give you a little assignment related to reviewing the single verb utterances that they make to identify relationships in the utterances. Because the Bloom and Lahey analysis is about relationship making that exists in language or organization. What do I mean by that? First, my point last time in when you were engaged with the language disorders course, one of my major points was that there are always 2 components that we have to account for in order to understand language. And that's any language, whether it's the English language or the Spanish language or Russian language or any language. 2 components. What are those 2 components? One of the components is the kinds of things the children learn as they engage with their environment and their particular culture and have experiences. And without a doubt, that aspect of language, what kids learn about the world that they ultimately talk about, that's critical to language learning. But the other part of language learning that is often overlooked and that takes a little more effort to get one's head around is the part of language that the child's mind contributes to the acquisition of language and the production of language. What does the child's mind do? What does the mind do neurologically that facilitates language acquisition and language production and language comprehension? What does the mind do? And if you remember, the point I tried to make was that what the mind does is drives the child to make relationships, to make relationships between things. So if you watch that little child with, again, who was popping beads together, the bead activity is it's no surprise that child engaged himself, by the way, spontaneously in the bead connecting activity, because bead connecting is a relationship making activity. And when I say relations, I mean basic putting things together and taking things apart. If you watch my kids playing on the bed with their little animals, you'll see them dressing or undressing the animals and doing other things that also involve relationship making. Because relationship making, another word for that is organization. And there are universal, built-in tendencies towards organization that contribute to language acquisition and language production and language comprehension. That is, the mind guides the child and guides you and me, ourselves as adults, even me. After all these years, what's left of my mind continues to drive me to make relationships among things. And relationship making involves putting things together again and taking things apart. And as humans, we make particular kinds of relationships. So I'm being very single-minded here and redundant in focusing on this relationship business. Because the Bloom and Lahey language sample analysis is about the relationships kids make when they have ideas, which is what they talk about, and when they generate language form to do the talking. Now let's review again. Language is what? Content, form, and use. And it's content, form, and use, always different separate things, content, form, and use, that operate together simultaneously. It's kind of like feels like a contradiction. On one hand, language is one thing, but it's made up of subunits of things. Language is a system that is made up of subsystems. Those subsystems are content, which is the ideas that kids talk about. Form, which is the symbol system that kids use to talk about their ideas. And that symbol system, by the way, is built up from phonology, morphology, and ultimately to syntax and even story grammar. And use, which is the pragmatic or social rules that kids have that they apply to accomplish the goals of language use. And use involves the goals themselves, why kids speak. So each of these things, content, form, and use, are separate things on one hand, but they work together on the other. It's important that we keep them separate as speech-language pathologists so that we understand when we evaluate children or when we treat children what is causing the problem for a child with a language delay, and how to establish goals and procedures to address those problematic components of language. Bottom line to think about is that language is about relationship making and that it's got content, form, and use components. This tutorial will focus on the content and the form components, content-form interactions. And let's think about the content. First of all, again, let's take another step back and recall that the model that we applied to understand language acquisition and language use was the intentionality model, Bloom's intentionality model. That means when kids develop language, and when any of us speak, language, the bottom line function of language is what? It is to express intentionality. What is intentionality? It involves content of mind, what we are aware of and focused on at any one moment. So content of mind drives language acquisition and language production and language comprehension. Our minds are on the meanings and on our intents. That's where our minds are at. Our minds are not on the sounds that we produce. It's not on the syntax. Not until we're adults, and basically adults who are speech pathologists and who tend to be metalinguistic and focus on form and use as well. Also school-age children, as they learn to read or have to take their language arts classes, teachers focus them on form aspects of language. And so they do become aware of language form. I don't want to suggest that kids are not metalinguistic. But then language becomes part of content of mind. So it's still content of mind. Content of mind. So the Bloom and Lahey language analysis is primarily focuses first and foremost on language content. Language content, that is the ideation or the content of mind or what the child is aware of when they speak, what they intend to talk about. Language, therefore, is a tool of cognition, and it exists in human beings to express ideas. It does not exist primarily as a tool to get what we want. Concrete things such as cookies or prizes or whatever. Not that that's not one of the intents, but the bottom line reason for language is what? It's to express anything that's on our mind, which could be something that we want, but it also is more typically about something occurring at the moment. My mind right now is on this tutorial. And again, this first part of the tutorial is intended to get your head into the underlying propositions, principles that drive the Bloom and Lahey language analysis. I'm going to post on here too. You will find it will pop up shortly the pages 186 and 187, the taxonomy, the Bloom and Lahey taxonomy. And you'll see that on the very top, tippy top of that taxonomy are content categories. And that, if you remember back to your the language analysis that you engaged in, and that we're going to be practicing again in this particular intercession tutorial, the number one focus, first and foremost focus, is on ideation. It's on the content of language. The idea that content drives language acquisition and language production. I can't say that enough. Ideation are ideas. Let me repeat again that therefore, when we think about ideas, we're thinking about always two components of ideas. There's the component of, again, what the kids learn or experience, what you and I experience in our environment and our culture, and that we internalize from our culture, the specific things we talk about, for example, this Lahey material, or a cookie, or a stuffed animal, or a set of beads, or whatever we're into at the moment, that specific thing. And the more general kinds of relationships, semantic relations that underlie our ability to talk. Point of view of categories of ideas that children have. And underlying the concept underlying these categories is that they involve relationship making. Each category of content involves a relationship or implies a relationship. That is organization. And let's think of what the content categories are. They are the reflexive object relation categories, which are existence, non-existence, and recurrence. They are the object relation categories, which are action, locative action, attribution, state. There are and a few others that we'll review. There are the event relations, additive, temporal, causal, etc. Adversative, epistemic, communication, those are the etceteras in object specification. We'll review those over the next, in fact, each of the next tutorials will focus on one level of content category. and the corresponding syntax that codes it. Now, each of these content categories, each of them implies a relationship or involves a relationship. So let's take a look at some single verb sentences, a couple of them, that exist a couple of these content categories. Let's look at one that an existence sentence, an action sentence, and an attribution sentence, okay? Okay, the existence sentences, this is a cat. This is a cat. Now that doesn't, what kind of a relationship is that? It's just focusing on the cat, right? Just one thing. But it implies a relationship, doesn't it? This is a cat. It's not just, this is the cat. For example, Martha the cat. No, this is a cat. So the cat belongs to the category of things called cats. So there's a relationship between this particular cat, this cat, and the category. And the relationship is, that's exactly the relationship, to be honest with you. It's between this particular cat and the category of things called cats. All the cats out there. And the implication, by the way, it's not a dog, it's not the floor, it's not the ceiling, it's a cat. It's not you, it's not me, it's a cat. Following me on that? Now that kind of a sentence, the relationship doesn't jump out at you. But a sentence such as the cat ate the mouse, the next action sentence, that's clearly a relationship between a cat and a mouse through the act of eating. Following that? Now relationship making is that simple. The next sentence is, the cat is black. Now this relationship is between the cat and a part of the cat. It's a part-whole relationship. It's the color of the cat and the fact that it's black. Each sentence, each of these sentences involves relationships, correct? Now if we look at one more sentence, the cat ate the mouse because she was hungry, that's a way more complicated relationship. But it's still a relationship between the cat eating an animal, eating, and being hungry. That's a more complex relationship. But notice that anytime we generate a sentence, any sentence at all, involves a relationship. Okay, so the relationship that's involved in in the generation of any sentence, that relationship making, that is the basic kind of relationship, the relationship making, I am claiming, and I believe the basis of the Bloom and Lahey analysis format is that when you evaluate language in children, your interest and focus should be on the basic relationship making that the child is engaging in when they generate sentences, and even single words when they're when there's no syntax yet available to the child. It's relationship making, because this relationship making is the function of mind. It is mind function. It is what the child brings to language learning. The kinds of relationships kids make when they generate existence sentences, action sentences, locative action sentences, attribution sentences, state sentences, causal sentences, etc. These kinds of relationships, they are human genetically based, intrinsic to the child relationships. They are what kids and adults and everybody throughout the world, regardless of culture, regardless of language that the individual will eventually speak or is speaking, regardless of the language the individual is listening to and are trying to understand, they are making these kinds of relationships. And it is critical. It is critical from a linguistics point of view, which is the point of view we're addressing language. We were addressing language from in our language disorders course, and that we address a language from the language acquisition course that at LIU precedes the disorders course. This linguistics angle focuses us on the relationship making primarily. And we use the specifics that the child is speaking about, which is of interest to the child, of course, the specifics, and to you and me, it's the specifics, to try to understand the relations, because it's the relationship making that is at the heart of language, the mind's organization and organizational abilities. That is at the heart of language, and it's at the heart of our job as speech-language pathologists. Yes, as speech-language pathologists, it is our job to identify the kinds of relationships, the language from the point of view of mind function, to understand if a child is having difficulty developing language or a delay in developing language. What is the root of that delay? What is the basis of that delay? We are responsible for trying to understand that, and then ultimately addressing the basis of the delay in our interventions. And our primary focus as speech-language pathologists is linguistic, and it is understanding what the mind is doing in the efforts to acquire and use language. And the mind, number one thing the mind does is makes relationships, is organizes things. So we will be, this Bloom-Lahey language, I'm obsessing on this during this first introductory session, to get you to obsess on this, to focus on this, to try to get your head around this business of relationship making and organization, because we're going to be evaluating utterances of children with reference to the fundamental structure or architecture or basis, the fundamental kinds of relationships or organization the child applies to language. And if you remember from the original course and your original assignment, the language sample assignment, that relationship is expressed first in our focus on the identification of content categories that are implicit in the utterances kids make, and the relationship which is really demonstrated in the syntax. And if you remember, the form of a syntax, remember, are the rules that apply to sentence creation, the rules that apply to sentence creation. And those rules are basically, bottom line, make relationships. And the relationships are always between a noun phrase subject, and a complement through the action of a verb. It's an SVC relationship, primarily. That SVC relationship is something we focus on absolutely directly, necessarily, to conduct the language sample and analysis, to conduct the language sample analysis. And that's such an important relationship that I, as you remember, require that before you do any identification of content or the idea relationship that's driving language, you mark sentences for subject, verb, and complement if the sentence has one verb. Now, the SVC relationship continues to apply in sentences that have multiple verbs. It absolutely does. But there's a second there are really two levels of relationships there. One is the SVC relationship, when there are two verbs, and the relationship between the two actions, the two verbs that are operating in the sentence. So that we are always focused on the SVC relationship in understanding language, because the SVC, the subject-verb-complement relation, is the kind of relationship that's being made in the child's mind regardless of the language the child is speaking. It is the relationship making that is accounting for language, production, and comprehension. The kids will produce sentences that have subjects, verbs, and complements, minimally subjects and verbs. And they will be trying to understand others by analyzing the subject-verb-complement relationships, the reflexive-object relations, the object relations, the event relations that the other person is talking about. They certainly also will be applying their knowledge of specific things, like if someone's talking about snow, the kid has to have some idea of what snow's about to understand that, yes, some specifics. Or if somebody is talking about curry, my kids right now are in Trinidad. I'm here doing this tutorial in dog sitting. In Trinidad, they're eating lots of curry. That's one of the parts of that culture. They have to have that experience to talk about it. But to say the sentence, I'm eating curry, that is the basis for the generation of that sentence is not only knowing about self and curry, but it's making the relationship between myself and, say, curried fish or whatever, through the act of eating. It's a relationship. So what I'm asking you to get your heads around in this particular, in moving towards the next the next 2 or 3 videos, lectures, is the idea that in doing a Bloom and Lahey analysis, we have to appreciate that the analysis focuses on relationships, the relationships underlying content of mind, and those relationships which are reflected in the syntax, the language form the child uses, or you and I use, to represent those ideas. Again, the relationships implicit in the content of mind are ideas that we're generating when we use language, when we speak or comprehend, try to comprehend others. The idea relationships, the relationships underlying the ideas, the type of idea relationships we're having, and the relationships that are made manifest, those relationships that are made manifest in the syntax that the child is using to do the talking. That is, in the content-form interaction. So, we meet. Well, you'll make that decision as to the next time you look at the video. I will be posting another lecture, probably today happens to be New Year's Day. So I am posting this particular introduction to the tutorial today, January 1st, 2016. The next one will be posted tomorrow, Saturday, or at the latest Sunday, and it will deal with utterances that have no syntax attached to them. That is what we call level 2 utterances, if you remember from the 640 course, and single verb sentences with reference to A, the content categories that the kids express using single verbs, and the SVC subject-verb-complement relationship implied in them. We will also distinguish between if you remember, verb relation content categories and non-verb relation content categories. Now, before we get to that, therefore, I am asking you to review the tapes that I'm reposting. One of them, I think, is a repost. One of them is a new tape on the child who was popping beads together and my own kids. With reference to my own kids, I would like each of you to identify 3 relationships that my children are making as they play with their little their plush animals. That's number 1. And then that's all this time around. Actually, after next lecture, I will be asking you to do some practice language sample analyses on the sample of my kids playing. Okay, again, I will see you next time. Again, Happy New Year's.